Hello, everyone, and welcome to our PCMH Winter Webinar Series. My name is Vicki Cochran, and I'm the Family Partnership Program Manager at Children's Mental Health Ontario. We have a peer support program for parents and caregivers of children and youth with mental health concerns called Parents for Children's Mental Health. And we highlight clinicians in the province and hot topics for families in our series. So today we're welcoming two clinicians from Crossroads Children's Mental Health Center in the Ottawa region, Marissa and Isabel. And I would love to turn it over to both of you to introduce yourselves.
Thank you so much for having us. We're super excited to be here. My name is Isabel McNider. My pronouns are she and her. I'm the clinical supervisor at Crossroads. I've been there for 6 years, and I've been interested in disordered eating and body image and all of this stuff since my undergrad. I did my undergrad at the Eating Disorder Treatment Center, CHEO, in Ottawa for my thesis, and have since just continued my research and being interested. And a couple years ago, we've developed a treatment protocol for kids at our Children's Mental Health Treatment Center in Ottawa, Crossroads. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So my name's Marissa. I use she, her pronouns. I get to work with Isabel at Crossroads here in Ottawa. I'm a child and family therapist as part of the clinical team. I have been interested on this topic for so long, and it's one of those special topics I can spend hours deep diving into the research, talk people's ear off about it. So I am so grateful I get the chance to share some of that with you folks. And those last couple of years really focusing in particular on how that looks for children and youth and how it can present a little bit differently.
Thank you so much. It is so great to have both of you here because we've been hearing from families across the province that they are worried about their children and youth's relationship to food. So this is exactly why we're here today, so we can hopefully share some information with folks. Can you help families understand what typical eating patterns might look like for different age groups? If we sort of think about that under 12 and then over 12 so that families can have an understanding.
For sure. So before we get started, I think it's important to have a non-judgmental, self-compassionate perspective. So some of the things we're going to talk about today, some caregivers may think, oh, I say that, I do that. So I just want to start by saying there is no judgment. These are a lot of the things we're talking about today. They're not general knowledge. They're not things that we talk about in our culture, in our everyday lives. So I just want to start with that. There are approaches that can help prevent eating disorders, disordered eating from forming later on, and that's what we're going to share with you today. So we are going to talk mostly to begin with around starting off, right, with our younger kids, because a lot of this starts with young kids and it develops into the youth's pattern. So it's not so much about, children eat a certain way, youth eat a certain way. A lot of it is where does it all start and how to prevent it from going to a place we don't want it to. So we will speak to youth, but the starting point is really the children, and that's also our specialization is under 12. So we're going to talk about the eating competency model by Ellen Satter. And so Ellen Satter speaks to the division of responsibility model. So the first thing is this is for prevention. This is for everyday eating. This is not a model that's appropriate if there's already disordered eating or other mental health concerns. So this is sort of when parents say, what are food rules, right? How do I teach my kids to have a good relationship with food? Ellen Satter developed this in her resources and research. So we have some information that you'll be seeing in the handouts, but essentially what it is parents decide what and when the children eat, and the children choose how much they eat. And so her resources go into a little bit more detail, but it is really as simple as that. So, what is being eaten? When is it being eaten? But then the children speak to how much. This will help them explore what they like, what they don't like. It also will teach them about hunger and fullness cues. So a lot of kids naturally stop eating when they're full. There are exceptions to that, we'll talk about later on, but generally kids naturally know when to stop eating and they'll stop when they're full and they'll eat when they're hungry. If we don't interfere with that natural pattern, then no intervention is required. So this approach promotes attitude of food neutrality. So what I mean by that is all foods are good foods. There are no foods that are morally superior. There's no good foods and bad foods. It's all neutral. They all have roles to play. If children don't learn of things that you shouldn't eat or are quote unquote bad, then they are naturally generally balanced. And so this gives parents some guidelines in terms of how to develop a good relationship with food.
That is really so helpful in terms of even distinguishing that this is a prevention piece. This is sort of how you start out with your kiddos and how you start to just embed some healthy routines. So I like that you talked about that because I think we hear so much information as parents that can be really confusing, right? So all foods are good food, for example. That's, I think, a game changer for families to worry a little bit less about some of the other rules we hear about that we need to follow. So thank you for that. Now that we better understand what's typical, what would be signs of disordered eating for a parent or caregiver to watch for when it comes to their child or youth's behavior or routines? Can you help us better understand that?
I'm going to start with talking a little bit about what we see in the younger kiddos and then how different things you may see when they grow older and become youth. So it's really common actually for kids around 3 to 6 there to be almost like a little natural pickiness around what type of food they like or don't like, right? And so that's kind of normal what we see. Now, when we start to get concerns about how that's impacting kiddo and the whole family, is when it's going beyond just the limited variety of foods. They're not wanting to try new foods as much, or maybe they like chicken, but it has to be the chicken McNuggets from McDonald's. Only those, not the Wendy's ones, right? Um, Often also to kind of normalize when someone, I find I work with people that are picky eaters, it's going to be the beige types of foods that they're going to feel most comfortable with. This can be really hard, I find, for folks because it says we grew up in this diet culture soup that those beige foods, French fries, chicken, aren't healthy in it. So it makes a lot of us really nervous. Now, what I think and what the research shows is that a lot of folks can get their nutritional needs met with a limited variety. Maybe they just need a little extra nutritional boost, a really good multivitamin. Okay. There is concerns when one, your kiddo isn't gaining weight, or because as kids, they're growing right up. So if they're not gaining weight, that's a concern, or if they're losing weight, also a concern. If your kiddo's coming to you and they're stressed about the fact that, there's only certain foods that they feel safe with, where they're like, oh, I can't go to my friend's birthday party because they're not going to have, they're not going to have chicken McNuggets. What am I going to do? I can't go. Then I think, okay, yeah, we need to talk about it. We need to work with someone around those things. And that's when we start going more into an eating disorder called ARFID, which stands for Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. Um, and so that's one thing that we see with the kids under 12. You're going to see a bit more often. Now, a lot of times when we think of disordered eating and eating disorders, we think of our youth, right? And typical onset of when those start developing, but we're seeing it, some of the, things that are being said of, I want to be healthy, starting much, much younger, right? There's 5-year-olds and research being shown to be aware that if I eat this, 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 it makes me smaller. And the association between I can change what I look like depending on what I eat. So It's something we start to already be aware of, keep a lookout for with our kiddos, and then with youth, you maybe keep a closer eye because they've just spent longer in this diet culture atmosphere that you may need extra help to kind of push back against those. Now, some of the behaviors that you may see, and it's one of those things, as time goes on, there's always going to be new ways, new things coming out on how people are doing things that kind of lead into disordered eating. And so, especially if the disordered eating is coming in a way that we're trying to make ourselves smaller. And so you're going to see maybe the amount of food they're eating is less, or maybe even the type of food where all of a sudden it's like, oh, they're not wanting, carbs or grains as much. All of a sudden that's not, it's just salads like that, as well as maybe there's association with time where there's the idea of desserts, desserts are always only on weekends, not during the week. These kind of periods of times where it's not allowed and then it's allowed, right? And so what's really hard is these things can be really slippery and tricky and can be really co-opted by wellness culture as I'm just trying to be healthy. Sometimes you'll see things like, I want to get the light version of the yogurt. I want to get the low fat, the diet versions. You hear a kiddo saying, I want to be healthy. I'm not going to have junk food anymore. I think I want to be vegan or vegetarian. A lot of these things, it's almost like helping you be aware that these could be concerns, and that just means you need to dig a little bit underneath it with your kiddo to see what's under, if it's related to wanting to change how they look or things like that. So there's definitely a lot of things specific to trying to make ourselves smaller in terms of the type of foods, counting, calorie counting, downloading apps on their phone that are weight loss based, Fitness Pal, those kind of little things. Now, there's also association with um, like exercising and how that can come in as a tool to kind of people try and, weigh the balances of if I gotta burn off that cookie I had, or oof, I want to make sure I do this so that I can have a really good dinner later. And the thing is, some folks start to hide this over time because they may recognize that people are getting concerned. So you have to start to keep your eye out for little things. Some people will hide that they're exercising, do it in their room, do it at night. Even when we think of kind of like trying to take back nutrition, some folks what can do is they can do things called purging, which can look like so many different ways nowadays, from, self-induced vomiting to taking laxatives to, exercising, for example, when you're hurt, you have the flu, like these rigidity in different types of ways. And so it can be really hard to see and sneaky, and you can be surprised and things catch you off guard. Another key one, because a lot of those are like how to make yourself smaller. Now, something that our body will naturally want to do if we're trying to make ourselves smaller is what can happen is people can do things like binges, right? Now, you don't need a restriction to have a binge, but what binges look like is there can be this feeling from the person of, I can't even control myself. I feel out of control and I just want to eat meat. And often there can be a lot of shame involved in it. So those things that you may see with that is you're finding wrappers in weird places, food's going missing. I just bought that box of cookies and now I can't find it. And so there's also that piece to the binge, and there can be a bit of a cycle too of restricting and then binging for some folks. There's then things you want to do to compensate, other folks different. It can look different for everyone. The other one I want to acknowledge too is that's becoming more common, and I feel that there's being more attention put onto it, is especially for folks that are trying to make themselves bigger, stronger, kind of toxic gym culture, where there are certain terms that could come up. You could hear kiddos saying of, I'm going on a bulk, I'm cutting, I gotta go, I gotta have high protein with everything. I gotta have the chicken and rice, and that's all they want, and they're measuring and weighing things. Those are also kind of cues that you should look out, that you want to kind of dig underneath with your kiddo about what's going on.
Wow, so much amazing information. And I think also acknowledging this happens to all genders in children, right? This is not just sort of a female-oriented thing, which I think we see often in society as it being posed as such. So you've covered a lot of really great things for parents to watch out for. So thank you for that. So you mentioned digging deeper. If parents and caregivers are noticing some of the things that you talked about, what are some ways that parents can do that that wouldn't be calling attention to it and would feel more like natural conversation and sort of not create what could be potentially a harmful or uncomfortable conversation with their kiddo? Can you help us understand that a bit?
So there's a couple key things I think we can kind of do. So in terms of even before we get to this point, I think it's always worth, especially as your kids are getting older, calling out when
Mhm.
you're seeing sizeism, when you're seeing, oh, look, diet culture and messages that aren't safe and aren't helpful, right? So it's kind of starting to build that vocabulary around the topic to
Mm,
begin with a little bit, right? And how there's sizeism, there's racism, ableism, all of these are connected and come out through a way of disordered eating, right? So there's that background can start to kind of build in. If some of these
interesting.
things are already happening, right? And you're like, oh no, I didn't do that yet. That's okay. We're all learning and trying out different things, right?
That's reassuring, Marissa. I think families will appreciate hearing that. So thank you for acknowledging that.
Yeah. And it can be, I think what happens too is we get so scared of saying the wrong thing and making things worse, right? I don't want to
Yeah,
say something that's going to stick with my kiddo and they're going to repeat and repeat, right? And so I think it's okay also recognizing we grew up also in this diet culture soup. So we have our own things that are sticking to us in it. But
100%.
generally, when I approach, a kiddo about it, anything like that, anyone you're concerned with, is really framing it as like the curious, not the judgment, not judgmental, very curious, being like, hey, I kind of noticed you mentioned you're thinking of going vegan lately. I wonder, if we can spend some time kind of talking about that. And so even just letting them know ahead of time you want to talk about it at a time when you know they're not going to be stressed, not when you're running out the door, you know, ideally not around when you're eating food, because that can also make it difficult in that moment. We want times around food to be a time for connection, relaxation, joy, not around those tough conversations. Let's do it outside of that, right? And then kind of digging to see if they're starting to create associations of being like, oh, I just want to be healthy. It's like, oh, what does healthy look like? And really just almost like you got to become a little bit of a journalist, asking those questions that you think maybe are obvious and really trying to get that out of them. And one of the big things we look for is if there's an aspect of intentional weight loss. If there's a point where your kiddo is saying, I'm doing this to lose weight, that is one of those, for me, when I hear it, I'm like, ding, 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 ding. I got to get in there, right? Because
Yeah, it's a calling.
when, yeah, and one of the biggest indicators of an eating disorder developing is intentional weight loss. So there's no, if we take from something called the Hayes model, health at every size model, there is no safe way to intentionally lose weight without increasing your risk of developing a completely life-altering eating disorder.
And I would
So
add
many
from the
points.
the
Thank you.
parent perspective too is being a parent myself, you have to put those worries aside in that conversation, right? So as a parent, you're thinking, oh, what about this? What about that? What if this happens? It can be very scary,
Mhm.
especially as we've shared all these red flags with you, all these yellow flags, and you might be concerned. So it's important, like Marissa said, the attitude of curiosity and non-judgmental listening. And as parents, we often skip to the solution or our version of things very fast, totally normal, but that's not what is needed here. It's really like, help me understand what's that like for you? Help me understand what you thought about that. That's a place that you can build off of and have those conversations and eventually weave in your perspective. But sometimes parents jump too fast to, yeah, but it's bad and you shouldn't do that. And often kids and youth, especially youth, will feel shut down by that. So it's important to not rush the trying to understand. And if what your kid is telling you is freaking you out, then that's where get support, right? You don't have to process your feelings in the moment. You can get support. You can unpack that with a professional and help you plan out future conversations.
Great tips, because I do think this can be a complicated conversation. And so I love that you're trying to slow us down as parents and recognize that it's normal to also be worried, acknowledge the worry, but not to bring it into the conversation. So I love that. That's fantastic. Thank you. Are there any physical changes that parents may notice if their child or youth is experiencing disordered eating?
I always start by saying, you know your child best, right? So when we talk about what's normal, what's typical, the starting point is always what you know of your child. So anything related to mental health, we're looking at sudden, recent changes and changes that persist over time. So just kind of put that into perspective when we talk about the physical changes. So Marissa already spoke to like weight. Any drop in the growth curve is not typical for for children, right? So children should be progressively increasing their growth curve, their weight gain over the years until it stabilizes as an adult. So any changes, either it's not going up or it's plateauing, would be something to speak to your doctor about. So, as well as any significant weight gain, right? Because we're looking at the spectrum of restricting food and also binging, and it's not always one or the other. It's a mix of all. Anything that's different, right, in terms of weight. Some of the things that can show up physically if there's disordered eating is hair loss, things in the metabolism, so changing in body temperature. So if your kid suddenly is cold all the time and showing that they're struggling to modulate their temperature, increase in tiredness, any irregularities in their period, so kids that have had their periods and it stops all of a sudden, or it was very regular and it's not. Any changes in sleep patterns for all mental health concerns, right? Changes in sleep can be a red flag. A lot of the things that Marissa was talking about may lead to physical changes. So digestion is a big piece there. So for instance, if the kids are restricting, you may see some constipation suddenly. And if they're
Mm.
suddenly using laxative, then you may see more diarrhea. So that could be a red flag. I'm just going to add a few behavior changes as well to Marissa's list is things like very concealing or very baggy clothing, right? So those might be subtle things that show up. Also, increased in emotional dysregulation. So your even keel, calm child all of a sudden has very strong emotions. I know when we talk about teens, that's tricky because
It is.
yeah,
Absolutely.
that's there. But again, what's your baseline for your kid, right? Is your, if your outgoing social kid is hiding in their room, if your sort of modest kid is suddenly wearing very revealing clothes, it's not necessarily a red flag, but like we said, be curious about that, maybe dig into that a little bit. And finally, like any loss of interests in hobbies or friends or things that they would previously be interested in might be something to be curious about.
And I love how you say always start with the fact that you know your kiddo best. And so, again, as parents, we have so many messages coming our way about what should and shouldn't be happening. But if you have that feeling in your gut that says this isn't the same as it was before, to pay attention to that, right? And to really listen in and then try to be curious with your kiddo about it. That makes a lot of good sense to us. So, how does disordered eating connect to mental health concerns for children and youth? Because with some of the behavioral changes or mood changes and things you've shared, that could be a lot of other things too. So, how does this connect and how do we know the difference?
the thing is, too, oftentimes they do go hand in hand, right? In terms of when we even look where, at the statistics of it, anxiety is really common, depression, OCD, like there's so much overlap between these different aspects, right?
Hmm.
And I think what can happen sometimes when we think about disordered eating is we kind of just see the tip of the iceberg and we think this is just about weight, body shape. I hear vanity, like it's just that, but that's really just the top. And there's so much underneath that it's really finding ways to help kiddo, right? Even in our ways of maladaptive coping, it's a way to kind of try and find a way to meet a need. And that's what disordered eating can do over time. One of the key things that we can see with disordered eating and is that we can be someone that has a hard time with feeling our emotions, or we feel emotions really deeply. And it can be like, I don't know what to do with all this. And so what can happen is a tool a lot of us use is maybe I want to avoid it, right? And that emotional avoidance lends itself to leading to disordered eating, which can then grow into a full eating disorder, right? And eating disorders are one of those mental health difficulties that is incredibly dangerous. There's no way to have just a little bit of an eating disorder and it be okay. When we look at it in comparison to other mental illnesses, it's in terms of the mortality rate, it was for a long time, highest mortality rate, specifically when we're thinking of anorexia. And so it's something we need to take very seriously because things can change very quickly. Within a month, you're in a hospital. And so if you have that inkling something isn't right, I think it's so much better to reach out and double check. Right?
100%. And I think, again, listening to yourself as the parent or caregiver, you know your kid best. So start to think about those action steps when you're being curious, right?
One other thing I wanted to bring up too is there's certain populations that there's shown increased vulnerability, increased risk. And so just to kind of be aware of that, if some of these identity markers resonate with for your kiddo, um, and we can just to kind of let you know. So there's our neurodivergent folks in terms if they have a hard time with sensory sensitivity or something called proprioceptive awareness. And so that's our awareness of what our body feels like inside. So if you're not really good at knowing when you're hungry or when you're full, that could maybe predispose you a little bit. Or if you're someone, when you get into it, you're hyper focusing, you're in it to win it, and all of a sudden hours and hours and hours have gone by, that's also something kind of look for. A lot of folks, there's also for folks that are part of our BIPOC population, so Black, Indigenous, and people of color. A lot of diet culture is about white thinness. And so there can be ways to try and fit in more where that's an extra toll. Our kiddos are a part of the queer population. If there's also the queer population in terms of they can show up in so many different ways. One that comes to mind for me especially is for our kiddos that are going on their gender journey. There's ideas of what certain genders should look like, and to try and ease gender dysphoria, this could be a way to help. If I associate, for example, masculinity with being big and muscles, I may do some things to try and do that, as well as the idea of there's certain ways we can do things to our body to make us feel better in terms of binders, which can interact with hunger cues and digestion. Then some other just quick ones I'll go through is if you're someone where your body is at its healthiest at a larger body size, increased risk of bullying. If you're an athlete, especially if you're engaging in sports where there's an aesthetic component to it, or there's weight categories, so thinking of like martial arts, wrestling.
Hmm.
And then if you have a kiddo who's They have some perfectionism in them, they have some difficulties with impulsivity, trauma backgrounds. All those things are kind of potential little pieces of the puzzle that could lead to something like this.
So if there's a history of those things there and a current state of those things, along with some of the other things you guys have already shared about around physical changes and behavioral changes and things, if all of those pieces are there, then again, time to kind of trust your gut and be
Mhm.
curious. How could parents and caregivers tell the difference between possible disordered eating and maybe just a phase, for example, or a stressful time in a child and youth's life? I heard you mention there's disordered eating and then there's having an eating disorder. And I think that's a really important distinction. Can you talk a bit more about how parents can tease that out?
hmm Yeah, I know we've said it multiple times, but I'm going to say it again. Knowing what's different from your
Mhm.
typical patterns is always important. People should have a variety of coping tools to deal with stress. So, food and exercise shouldn't be the only options. We always talk about emotional eating is something natural, babies do it. There's no judgment in eating to soothe feelings. We know that exercise feels good for a lot of people and brings all these like hormonal boosts. All of those things are fine, but if those are the only coping tool that your child has. If your child uses food or exercise to cope with stresses in life and really struggles if they don't have access to that, that's something that can indicate that it might be problematic. So, again, look at the big picture. Look at balance over time. So, for instance, during exams, right? If something stressful is going on, periods of grief, we would expect people to have less of an appetite, maybe see some of those changes, but they would go through it at a certain point and rebalance, right?
Mhm.
So if you think about having the flu, you won't eat for a whole day and you'll slowly work back up to sort of balanced eating. So look at the big picture and look at patterns over time. Some of the things that are a bit beyond the scope of our talk today, but is really important are things like medication, right? If your child or youth is on a new medication, a lot of them have side effects that include the eating. So that's definitely something that you should talk to your doctor about. And then there's special concerns like neurodivergence. So if you have a child with autism, that eating profile might look really different. And like Marissa mentioned, they are a population that's increasing risk for eating disorder. We're seeing more kids with neurodivergence and eating disorders, and that can be a really complicated thing. And starting really young, if you don't have a hunger and fullness cue, if you have certain rigidity around textures and foods, there can be a whole lot of different reasons why kids on the spectrum, if you speak to autism moms and ask them
Mhm.
about their kids eating, almost all of them will have some kind of story to relay. So that can be something that can be supported by people specializing in autism, but also you'd want someone with an understanding of disordered eating if that's some of your concern. So a lot of occupational therapists, these are things that they're very used to dealing with, and they would have training in terms of typical eating and problematic eating. And then when kids on the spectrum get a little bit older, or if they're more socially aware and engaged in their community, then the treatment would look like typical kids, right? We don't have a different mental health treatment of disordered eating for people on the spectrum. We just adapt it like we would for anyone. So when they're really
Right.
young, OTs, doctors, more of those developmental specialists. And as they get
Mhm.
older, a lot of the things we talked about today would apply to neurodivergent kids as well.
That is so helpful just to have an understanding of what to think about and what services to start seeking based on your kiddo's needs. And again, going back to you know them best. So if you have that feeling that it might be bordering on disordered eating, to really get that help and support. I have two boys that have ADHD, and so that's been a part of our family's journey, just the different eating needs and the medications and the impact that has, but it's always been a part of the conversation with doctors. So I like that you highlighted that. It's really important to bring this information to any specialist that you're working with. So thank you. I also think about those moments when, as a parent or caregiver, you're looking at your child or youth and thinking, but they're so beautiful and healthy. why are they struggling like this? I think that's a really hard place for parents to be, is to just look at their child thinking they're so healthy, they look so great, I love them so much, I hate that they're suffering. Can you help us understand what might be going on for our kids that might be experiencing disordered eating or an eating disorder?
It can be so hard to understand because you see, your baby, you see the beautiful, amazing parts of them, right?
Exactly.
And I kind of frame it as this perfect storm that takes place where there's all these different little factors. And it's the combination of those with a little bit of like an underlying vulnerability that this maladaptive coping of disordered eating disorder kind of can just come in and take hold a little bit. And what's so hard too is this can happen to anyone. You do not have to look a certain way, be a certain shape or size for disordered eating to come into your life. There's no one way that it looks.
Hmm.
And I know that sometimes we can really get caught up in wanting to know the why. Like, what was it? Was it this? Was it that? Which I can understand because then if we know what it is, we can fix it. I just have to do this, which would give such relief to try and take that pain away from your little one. And I can see to a degree we can look into that, but I don't want it to take away from where we are today and moving forward with it, right?
Mm-hmm. That makes
Um,
sense.
it's very hard. And, something I think is a way to think of it is when your kiddo is struggling with something like this too, they may act in ways that don't reflect who your child really is. When they're struggling with this, we have kids that do all types of things, throwing dishes, yelling, saying horrible things. And I always like to keep in my mind that in those moments, you are face to face with that. With a lot of kiddos, the way I do is I frame it as like this animal on your shoulder. And it's whispering into your kiddo's ear or it's yelling in your kiddo's ear. And when your kiddo is doing that, throwing that plate, you are face to face with that animal. And you get a glimpse of what your kiddo could be hearing and dealing with throughout the whole day. And so when you get so mad and you can't believe your child's doing this, you're mad at the disordered eating. You're mad at the eating disorder. You love and care too much for your child to let this disordered eating animal take over.
I really appreciate bringing it outside of who your child actually is, right? Because that's so important. And often, as parents and caregivers, we can be stuck in our own worry and forget that. So, that's a great way of framing it for us. We've heard lots about what to look for, what to pay attention to trust our own gut as families, what disordered eating might look like. I'm wondering if you can talk to families about what they can do to support their child or youth at home in promoting a healthy relationship with their bodies and food.
There's actually a lot that caregivers can do. And just starting with the awareness that we're part of diet culture, and we've used the
Hmm.
term wellness culture, and that might be something that caregivers are familiar with or not. And so, a bit about wellness culture is there was a shift in our society where people recognize that dieting is bad and we're not supposed to diet, and this sort of big body positivity movement. And so, a lot of the messaging has been adapted under wellness. So that's why we say things like it's sneaky, it's co-opted, because we know that Weight Watchers rebranded themselves and promoted wellness and then released a weight loss app for kids. So those messages are there, but they're sneakier.
Hmm.
I just want to start by recognizing that ourselves as caregivers, we are part of that culture. And so a lot of it is how we speak about ourselves in front of the kids. So you talked about kids. Parents see their kids and they think they're beautiful. Kids do the same with us. They think we're beautiful. They think there's nothing wrong. So, how we speak about ourselves, about our bodies, how we talk about food. Oh, I'm bad. I'm having this chocolate. Kids take that in. They hear what we're saying. So again, looking at all foods are good foods and not saying you have to earn your dessert, right? I can eat this. I had a long workout
Oh, so
today.
many of us grew up that way, Isabel. That's
Yeah.
hard.
And you
Yeah.
see it over the holidays,
Hmm.
this cookie means 30 minutes, right? We don't have to earn our foods. Food is not something you have to earn, but you can only really lean into that if you're not terrified of weight. So again, it's all this fear of being big and being in a bigger body. A lot of it too is not glorifying certain body types as being better than others, right? So all bodies are good bodies, also super difficult. In terms of body image, we like to speak about body neutrality. So that might be a term that's new for a lot of caregivers. Body positivity is, I love myself, my body's amazing. It's another term that's been a little bit co-opted. It started off as being this really positive thing, and now it can be also masked as people in smaller bodies talking about body positivity. Anyway, that
Mm.
we can go on a whole tangent with that, but
That's
we
a
like
whole other webinar, I
a
feel
whole other
like.
webinar.
Just that, yes.
But we
Yeah.
like to think about your body as an instrument, not an ornament, right? Your
Mhm.
body
I love that.
is not meant to be decorative. You don't exist to be attractive to other people, to be visually appealing. Your body is an instrument. If you're able-bodied, there's lots of movements you can do. You can do movement that feels good. You can play sports, you can dance, you can draw, you can color, you can write stories, really emphasizing the body as an instrumental tool, not an ornamental tool. So another aspect of body neutrality is how I feel about myself is not related to my appearance. Now, that's a lofty goal, and I think a realistic goal is my appearance is not the only thing that's important about me. And so this is where when kids say, "Oh, am I fat?" and caregiver will say, "Oh, you're not fat." That's actually like a secret message that fat is bad. And
Mm.
in a way, a better message is, uh, well, there's different sizes, and some people are bigger, some people like fat is a neutral word, it's not a bad word. And that's not the most interesting thing about you is your body size. That's a neutral thing about you, like the color of your eyes, the color of your hair.
Those could be some really big shifts in
Yep.
thinking and talking and how you carry yourself. So I'm hearing so much about, even as the caregivers and parents, we need to be really mindful and thinking about those things ourselves too, and challenging our own thoughts and beliefs on these things.
Yes, and in the work that we do, caregivers often, it's a hard shift for them. We need to
Yeah,
do work with them. Some people don't agree with some of these principles, and that's
for
okay,
sure.
right? So we have to change what we value in our society. Now, that's again a lofty goal, but just being aware that in our society we value smaller, thinner, white bodies, right?
Hmm.
And that's been a norm that's been set. Then just being aware of those messages. So if you're seeing it on social media, you're seeing it in what your children are exposed to, you can speak to that. So some of the comments that might seem positive can actually be harmful. So, oh, you lost weight, you look so good, implies that smaller is better. It's good to give compliments, not overly focusing on physical appearance. And as a parent, I've had to be really intentional with that. We're so used to saying, "Oh, you're so pretty," or "You look so great," but thinking about, "Oh, you're smart, you're kind." And physical
Mm.
appearances can be, "Oh, what a cool outfit." Really brings out your personality. So just starting to de-emphasize the physical appearance. We talked a little bit about health at every size. Again, big topic, lots of resources out there, but really health at every size is this idea that your body size is not the only thing we want to think about when talking about health. There's people in big bodies that are very healthy, and there's people in small bodies that are very unhealthy. And so just looking at body diversity and trying to not add to the weight stigma. And so people in bigger bodies are not automatically unhealthy. And yes, there is research about weight, but there's actually a lot of research that shows that there's other things that are a bigger contributor to poor health. Like, for instance, bullying and weight stigma are really big contributors to poor health. And so sometimes parents, well-meaning, are concerned about health, and what they do actually have a negative impact. So think about being neutral in how we
Hmm.
talk about bodies, avoiding fat shaming, obviously, that goes without saying as a culture. Make home a safe space. So make home a place where you can talk about diet culture, you can talk about weight stigma, you can have these conversations about society, social media, Facebook, all of that. Well, I guess kids aren't on Facebook. Whatever,
Some might
TikTok.
be.
Yeah,
I know some youth who jump on Facebook because they connect with family that way, but they would never maybe admit it to their peers.
that's right.
So
Yeah,
you never know.
TikTok. So yeah, so being aware of your own bias, and a lot of caregivers may have to start by educating themselves, consuming new kinds of literature, talking to professionals, listening to podcasts. There's a lot of great stuff out there. We'll share some later. And so it starts with you, and you have a lot of power to shift your child's perspective. So it's good that people are here and learning, because that is going to have a big impact on kids' mental health.
Well, and I think it's never too late to learn,
Hmm.
right? It's never too late to
Absolutely.
learn or shift your messaging. And so I think that's a really key message. So if a family is noticing behavioral or physical changes and they're doing what they can at home, kind of following some of the tips you've gone through here, they're promoting a healthy relationship with food and neutrality with their bodies, but are still worried and don't see changes happening, what can they do? What's next?
A lot of these messages we've talked about is counterculture. And you're swimming upstream sometimes. And when you're doing something really hard like that, having a support team, finding community that aligns with those messages and values that you have, trying to find other people. I know a lot of times there's worries, for example, around social media and the harm it can do. There's ways we can leverage it to help us with those messages and find those communities if we're having a hard time. Now, I do think, I always am like, reach out, check in, talk with a professional, someone that's trained on eating disorders, disordered eating. The reason it's so special to reach out to someone who has that training is because it is sneaky and slippery, and it will co-opt things and find little ways to twist things where you're second guessing yourself. So you got to work with someone who's really grounded in some of these beliefs and has done the work on their own personal biases. Now, the big red flag that would tell me you should reach out 100% if you're kind of on the fence about it, if your kiddo isn't gaining weight, losing weight, or if they're engaging in any type of like purging, laxatives, or making them self-induce like vomiting, because those can require medical support to make sure all your organs are healthy, the electrolytes are healthy. Those are the ones where you should be reaching out right away.
We know that wait lists can be long, and there's probably a family or two or many that are listening and saying, you know what, I've done everything that you've suggested here. I'm on a wait list. I'm still waiting for help. What would you say to a family experiencing this?
I know that there's long wait lists, but there's also a lot of free and accessible resources. So let's talk about some of those things today.
Great.
So Marissa already spoke about specialized help, right? So this is a specialized field. And what I mean by that is a therapist doesn't automatically get this training. Actually, doctors don't automatically get this training. We often, with our clients, will see doctors congratulate youth on losing weight and not see the red flags that the families are seeing. And so it's important that you're working with people where this is their bread and butter, this is stuff that they're grounded in, and they know this very well. Some of the things that I kind of want to just take a step back and talk about the medical piece, because some of the things might get missed by the medical professionals and may need you to access support. And there might be concerns that we don't want you to miss. Marissa, I'm wondering if you can speak to when parents and caregivers should bring their kids to the emergency room.
I think it's really important to always know that sometimes that is what's needed, right? If you have a child, especially if they are restricting, and one of the big risks and one of the main organs that can really get hurt when you're restricting is your heart. And so if you have a kiddo that is having chest pain, can't catch their breath, and you know that they have the history of restriction, go in right away, call 911. Those are kind of some really big concerns that we're looking out for. confusion, things like that, you go in and you see someone right away. Now, I also acknowledge that sometimes it's the idea of maybe it's not at that level, but you feel like you need to see someone. But it's hard to have a family doctor sometimes and find someone on who to connect to with some of these in terms of getting blood tests, weight monitoring. And so sometimes it is, you have to go to a walk-in clinic because we all deserve that support for our health and wellness.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing too is for parents to not be afraid to be an advocate around this and asking for a referral to a specialist of eating disorders or disordered eating, because I think a lot of times as families we go into medical professionals expecting they know everything. And I think it's a really important distinction to remember that that might not be the case and that it's okay to ask for more.
That's right. And to build on that, so some of other resources that parents can access to educate themselves. So if it's available to you, obviously private counseling, if that's something that's accessible to you through your benefits or financially, again, look for people that this is what they specialize in, especially that they work with young kids. And so counseling is one of the options. And then options that are available for everybody. So peer support through centers like PCMH. There's a lot of peers that will have had these experiences, and you can always learn the most from other caregivers who've struggled with this journey. One of our great resources in Canada is NEDIC, the National Eating Disorders Information Center. Lots of great handouts, lots of great tools there. They also have a helpline that you can call and ask questions and educate yourself around, ARFID or other forms of eating disorder. So that's a really good site. BANA, the Bulimia Anorexia Nervosa Association. We talked about the Ellen Satter Institute. Again, her books are available at the public library. She's written a couple books, and she's very generous with her resources on her Facebook page, on her website. So there's stuff there you can read, that you can download. There's presentations you can watch. Body Peace Canada is another resource. If you happen to be local to Ottawa, you can come and visit us and we can talk about some of these things. There are a lot of support out there, but the key thing I think is making sure that it's specialized support, and general practitioners may not have the tools that you need. So make sure that the person knows more than you do about how to support kids with disordered eating.
Yeah, those are great resources. And I just want to share that if anyone's watching this or listening, we will have the handouts available, and we'll have an email that you can reach out to get those if you didn't sign up to receive them already. I also want to point out One Stop Talk, which is that provincial initiative. Wherever you are in the province, if you don't know where to start, your child or youth can actually call that number. And as a parent or caregiver, you can call as well and let them know specifically this is what you're dealing with, and they can make some references to what might be available in your own community.
That's a great idea. And actually, Marissa is going to be joining One Stop Talk in 2 weeks. And
Amazing.
our Crossroads staff who are trained are part of One Stop Talk because the single session access points are a great way to start. And then they can refer to local community resources. And yeah, you may get matched with someone that doesn't have this expertise, but part of it is connecting you to local resources. So
Yeah.
they will be able to help you figure out, should I be concerned? Are there mental health concerns here? And help you with the next step. So great province-wide resource for sure.
And again, not to be afraid to ask directly for what you're looking for and what you think your child or youth needs. So I always like to point that out because I think we doubt ourselves sometimes, or we think that we're standing in front of someone that knows better than us. And it's okay to ask questions and to ask for what you're looking for specifically. So thank you for all of those great resources.
I actually have one more that I think can be helpful, especially when you're working with health professionals, is there's certain health conditions that I find some of the messaging can be harmful and really encourage diet talk. And so the website of Health at Every Size has really good resources on how to get support around those health concerns. So common ones I hear where it can come up is things with if you have diabetes, high cholesterol, how to treat those concerns in ways that's not going to add fuel to eating disorders, disordered eating habits.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for adding that, Marissa. That's very important. Those are some great resources. And what I would love to sort of wrap us up with today are some key takeaways for families to remember if they're listening.
So, body neutrality might be a new word for you today, a new term, but get comfortable with it so you are more than your physical appearance. Limit emphasis on bodies as a source of complimenting or shaming. Health at every size. Healthy bodies come in different shapes and sizes. All foods are good food. Food is morally neutral. No food is inherently good or bad. Movement should feel good. Movement is not a source of punishment or something that you do to earn food. So it should feel good and joyful. And reach out for support early. Early intervention matters.
Amazing. Thank you both so much for joining us today and helping to educate, support, and empower families about disordered eating and eating disorders. And we hope everyone has a lot of takeaways and lessons in this. If you have any questions, you can reach us at support@pcmh.ca. Thank you so much and have a great day.